There have been many times throughout history where some kind of idea or innovation is introduced to the world, and then it gets ridiculed and discouraged, and then eventually just fades away into obscurity. But then as time passes by, we look back at it and think, wait, maybe there was something there. Well, in 1995, Microsoft introduced a product intended to be the next evolutionary step of computing. Its name was Microsoft Bob. And if you haven't heard of it, well, don't blame yourself, because following its launch, Microsoft pretty much never acknowledged it ever again. And the success of Windows 95 just around 6 months later really overshadowed its lackluster performance with consumers, and the entire product was essentially just forgotten to time. So what was Microsoft Bob? Well, it was basically an add-on for Windows, specifically intended to make using the computer easier, almost more literal. If you wanted to set up an appointment on your calendar, rather than opening your calendar in Program Manager, you could actually physically go over to the calendar hanging on the wall and access it that way. You look a little lost. Do you need help? Well, now you don't have to read these convoluted manuals with just dozens of pages. You can just ask your pet dog, Rover. He is always here to help. The entire point for Microsoft was to make something intimidating like a computer seem not all that different from the things you would do in real life. But unfortunately, this message was not communicated the right way, and the whole product completely failed. And just from looking at it without knowing anything, it's immediately obvious why. This looks more like a kid's video game than a practical operating system for a professional computer user. People also complained of performance issues and, ironically, thought it was even more confusing than the regular Windows. Since its inception, Microsoft Bob has been considered by many as one of the worst tech products of all time. Whew. Now that's pretty harsh, but is it really deserving of such a title? Regardless of what you think, Bob has since proven to be quite influential. It was the program that inspired Microsoft Clippy, which would lead to the creation of Cortana, and even introduced Comic Sans. Maybe I'm not helping my case there, but either way, I would argue that this program was trying to solve a problem that didn't exist, but was going to. And now we're seeing new products emerge that do encompass the experience and feel that Bob was trying to convey, but simply didn't have the resources or even audience to accomplish that. Was Microsoft Bob really a failure? Or was it just too ahead of its time and misunderstood? You know, everyone thinks it's so easy to just build a website these days. So easy. It's what they say. It's so easy. And that's because it is, thanks to Squarespace. Squarespace allows you to build a website for whatever you want. Are you starting a restaurant? A blog for your cat? Starting a restaurant for your cat? They've got you covered, as Squarespace gives you all the tools you need to make a website that fits you. One of my favorite features is called Fluid Engine. Most website builders can often be limiting, and when they have these grid layouts that only let you place things on certain parts of the page, it shows. But Fluid Engine doesn't do that. You can place anything anywhere you want. And if you're unsure on certain design choices, you can choose a pre-made template and customize it however you please. If you're a business owner, Squarespace has a built-in online store, removing the hassle of having multiple pages open with other platforms and allowing you to keep everything all in one place. And as someone who isn't always very organized, the Asset Library tool is a lifesaver. I don't have to keep all these files on my computer, taking up hard drive space. Instead, I can just upload it and access it online whenever I want, wherever I want. Squarespace has actually allowed me to be more organized and have a cleaner state of mind when working on my channel. And if you go to squarespace.com/nationsquid, you can save 10% off your first website or domain name. So download Squarespace. Be there or be square. Now, the story behind Microsoft Bob is very similar to the story behind Clippy, and that's no coincidence, as these stories both share a common ancestor, an ambition to make the computer easier to use, to bring it closer to reality. As we've talked about many times before on this channel, The Macintosh back in 1984 was a huge step in this direction. Although not the first, the Macintosh was revolutionary in that it made something called the graphical user interface popular. Before this, computers almost always had to be used through a command line on the screen, where you had to manually type in commands to make it do a certain task. But what if you're not a nerd? Instead, what if you're some nobody who knows nothing about computers and doesn't have the time or patience to learn? But still, you want to take full advantage of the amazing complexities of these machines. Well, that's what the graphical user interface did. Instead of a command line, you now had a screen with icons, folders, a trash bin for things you want to get rid of, all resting on something called a desktop. And to navigate, you just move this thing around called a mouse. It essentially acted as the arbitrator between man and machine, turning the complex into the simple. What once took years of experience and a few lines of code could now be done with just one click of a button. The Macintosh took a technology that was moderately underground and still in development and made it the new industry standard of computing. Naturally, you have other GUI programs popping up left and right just a little bit after, like a program called Windows. Ever heard of it? Despite having a rocky start, Windows was really starting to gain popularity among computer users, especially as newer versions came along and improved things. It was only a matter of time until MS-DOS was well on its way to becoming the #1 most used OS in the whole world. And it was all thanks to this program. But there was still one problem. Windows wasn't easy to use. Yeah, it was getting easier, but they still had a long way to go, and if you were just learning about computers for the first time, it was quite the learning curve. Yeah, it was easier than typing in code, but its interface was going to take some getting used to. Not only that, it was boring. It felt very utilitarian and focused on just getting things done and nothing else. And if you're expecting your customers to use these machines in work environments for hours on end, you probably should add a little bit of personality to them. So how do we do that? How do you create a product that solves both these problems at once? Well, that's when Microsoft got to work. In my video on the tale of Microsoft Clippy, I dive a bit into a special concept that was permeating the air of the tech world back in the late 1980s and early 1990s, something called the media equation, a term coined by Clifford Nass and Byron Reeves, professors and researchers at Stanford University. Although their research was officially published in 1996, the media equation as a concept was becoming pretty well understood throughout the past decade. It all surrounded a very simple idea. The more time people spend on computers, the more they treat them like humans. And when these machines exhibit qualities that are more human-like, people find them better to use and computer efficiency increases. The average person may not know what complicated computer code is, but they know what an office is, what a desk is, and so on. But what if Microsoft could do even better than the Macintosh? It's been over 10 years, might as well give it a try, and Microsoft really believed that they had something. So much so, they even boasted it in the product's name, Microsoft Utopia. And this project aimed to check as many boxes as possible when it came to the media equation. What is one way you can make your computer seem more human? Well, by adding characters, of course. Not only that, characters you can interact with, ask questions, all kinds of things. And you could even choose which character you wanted to speak with. This also included a turtle, a rat, a dinosaur, just to name a few. What if instead of a desktop, you had an entire house? And what better way of conveying these Windows programs than through familiar objects that people use every day, like alarm clocks, rooms, things like that? Microsoft took it even further when they decided that the product's name could be even more human. According to many surveys at the time, people claimed that one of the friendliest human names they could think of was Bob. And so the Utopia project was promptly changed to Microsoft Bob. Because this wasn't just a computer program, it was a person. The friendliest person, in fact. And so Microsoft Bob was released to the public on March 10th, 1995, at a retail price of $99. But Microsoft didn't understand that the Greeks had two meanings for the word utopia, the good place and the place that cannot be. And that couldn't be more fitting than in the case of Bob. The program received a ton of backlash and pretty much did the exact opposite of what it intended to. If anything, people felt even more alienated by computers, and the main reasons for why really boil down to three things: the program's design, Microsoft's inability to understand its audience, and the lack of resources available to make the concept work. Yes, despite its whole existence focusing on being easy to use, people complain that Microsoft Bob's design actually made it harder to use than Windows. It's important to keep in mind that although there were many different types of computers with many different operating systems at the time, there was an inherent commonality between them. Next was different from macOS, but they shared enough similarities where you could tell they were both operating systems, and if you spend enough time, you could eventually get the hang of them, learning curves and all. But when you come out with something that looks so different, just as people are getting used to this standard of computing, it's going to create a big culture shock, despite it maybe being easier in practice. Am I looking at an operating system or a picture? Or is this a desktop background? I can't tell. Even though the calendar icon is technically right in front of the screen, people don't really know what that kind of setup is supposed to mean in the computer world. And this industry standard changed that. It's hidden in plain sight. And that's because even though we like familiarity, we know innately that computers and reality are different. If you want to use a calendar in real life, you walk up to it. But you can't walk up to a digital calendar through the screen. So how do you convey that? Well, through just clicking and dragging a mouse, of course. But again, there was already a standard for how this type of interaction should be expressed. And when you change that into something too familiar, it will take your user a minute to fully understand it in a backward sort of way. The Macintosh was familiar, but it still embraced its computer side. Microsoft was trying too hard to not be a computer. When you have to use computer tools to navigate it, that makes things a bit disorienting. Just like how command line computers were too hard to use, Microsoft Bob was extreme on the opposite side and tried to be too easy. And when that goes too far, you sort of end up undermining your target audience. This wasn't just trying to be easy, it was almost talking down to you. This doesn't look like a computer program, but instead a children's toy. In fact, even I fell for that. Microsoft Bob was a little bit before my time, but I did know about it and see people using it growing up. And I thought it was a video game until about a year ago. I had no idea that this, in many respects, was meant to be the eventual replacement for Windows. Could you imagine the Pentagon using this? We just received an anonymous tip. Someone got a hold of the nuclear codes. Rover, get to work. Rover. Yeah, the overly cutesy wootsiness got old really quickly. But not only that, it actually slowed things down. This is what opening the Start menu looks like in Microsoft Bob. This is what it looks like in Windows. Yeah, way quicker. And compounding that with the program's demanding hardware requirements, it was a recipe for disaster. But these limited resources go beyond the typical hardware on a personal computer. Resources within the tech industry itself inhibited the program's ability to succeed. And it's in this respect where I do believe that, in spite of all these other problems, Microsoft Bob may not have exactly been a failure, but instead a misunderstood prodigy ahead of its time. When you consider everything we just talked about, Microsoft Bob was basically a precursor to augmented reality, a technology we're now seeing pop up everywhere. This program, back in the 1990s, was trying to communicate that if you wanted to use a computer program, it should be as easy as walking up to it, like with a calendar or alarm clock. But with the technology of the time, you simply couldn't do that. But now, you can. If you want to use a program on, say, the Apple Vision Pro, all you have to do is literally walk up to it. It is doing what Bob tried to do, but this time it has the privilege to use advanced technologies that make it possible. If Microsoft Bob accomplished anything, it's that it foreshadowed what the world of computing was going to look like within the next few decades. As each day passed by, computers and real life would merge close together and soon become indistinguishable. But a 1990s world didn't understand this, and so the product fell short. It was a revolutionary idea, all right, just like the Macintosh, but it wasn't the right place or the right time. And so, Microsoft found other ways to be innovative, ways that the world at the time could understand. Half a year later, Windows 95 would be released, and the industry standard of computing would change once again. Rover wants you to check me out on Patreon, by the way. That's what he told me. Patreon.com/NationSquid. He also said you could buy me a coffee. His words, not mine. But hey, I'm not going to protest. A special thanks to my patrons and channel members for making this video possible. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and click the notification bell so that you never miss a future video.